I just want to offer a few disclaimers about this paper before I present it. I always do this, so anyone who knows me will think this is a very standard thing. This work is based on two different projects, one of which came out of work that I did with Kalervo Gulson and Mona Gleason, some of which is yet to be completed. Grant writing project about youth and moral panic in 3 different places. One, the suburban fringe of Paris, Aulnay-sous-Bois, Hackney, London, and Vancouver. I'm presenting Vancouver data, which relates to this very indirectly. The second project was a SSHRC-funded project on youth and social exclusion, which began in Toronto in 1999. Also on the suburban fringe, I think we could safely say that's what it was, of the inner city of Toronto. And began as a story, trying to account for stories of young women in the media who were homeless and identified as working class. And eventually evolved into a 3-year ethnography of young working class communities living on this fringe and navigating what was seen by them and the community as radical urban change. It then led to, when I moved to Vancouver, comparison of that work, and so I'm presenting some piece of that, but primarily the Vancouver story. It's also based on pieces of work which will come out in our book with Jackie, Lost Youth in the Global City, and a paper we've recently published, so I just want to make sure people understand where this work is coming from. I want to thank them for allowing me to present this. Oh, sorry, one more disclaimer. It also stemmed from doing a review of a Noop's book, which I did for British Journal of Sociology of Education, where I was forced to reconsider the British context of youth subcultures, particularly the mods, which you're going to see some photographs of shortly. So, Impossible Citizens in the New Global Metropolis, Urban Legends, Reclassifications, and the New Folk Devils of the 21st Century. It's going to be fun. Sex panics, witch hunts, and red scares are staples of American history, sociologist Duggan writes. While often promoted by relatively powerless but vocal minorities hostile to cultural difference, they have been enthusiastically taken up by powerful groups in an effort to impose rigid orthodoxy on the majority. In the case of the panics over the welfare state, moral reform functions as a trope for the neglect of substantive social problems relating to income inequality, race, and sexism. You know, a little bit dated, but provides the background for thinking about the relationship between youth, moral panic, symbolic racialization, and sexuality in the 21st century. In this paper, I'm attempting to map out some of the contemporary dimensions of class relations among young people who both produce and serve as targets of contemporary moral panic in new times. In particular, I'm interested in the effective, in inverted commas, using the work of Stephanie Lawler here, and cathetic aspects of being in quite a new set of urban imaginations and arrangements, and the implications for young people living in those spaces. I'm particularly concerned with moral panic and low-income male and female youth operating at the suburban fringe. Why? Primarily because in these new urban arrangements, in many global metropolises, we are no longer talking about low-income economic disadvantage among young people in the urban core, but we're talking about being pushed to the fringes of that core so that urban cities become respectable global sites of mobility. I focus in particular on young people's friendships and rivalries and relationships to wider forms of moral panic and their accounts of security, citizenship, some of this you'll see, notions of terror, and its links to racialization and wider forms of urban belonging. I also assess how something like gender and sexuality might impact on how young people's ambiguous concerns about urban transformations shape the ways in which they begin to classify themselves in this space and create new classifications there as well. So one of the arguments is that their aspirations for themselves and others in these quite new urban racial geographies of change and retrenchment begin to reshape how they classify themselves in relation to the state and how they classify people who would be identified in many cases as similar to them as opposed to different. I'm using terms such as, and I won't be talking a lot about this, but a little bit, a term by Paul Ricoeur called modality of symbolism. In other words, how the visual dimension of symbols exceed their own frontiers, used by young people. The concept of Sarah Ahmed's of passing, in other words, passing through urban spaces and arrangements, which then become the possibility for reclassifying, and limit situations, death, war, poverty, famine, and crisis, to explore how race and its associated forms of moral panic become deeply tied to wider forms of spatial and cultural exclusion on the urban fringe. Let me share another quote with you. This is one by Stephanie Lawler in the UK. George Orwell famously declared the real secret of class distinctions in the West, you can see the quotation marks, I won't announce them, are to be summed up in 4 frightful words: the lower classes smell. What was at issue for Orwell was less literal, real or imagined, than what smell signifies. The alterity for the middle classes of working class existence. Being disgusted is at the very core of their subjectivity. Their very selves are produced in opposition to the low, and the low cannot do anything but repulse them. This is not simply a matter of cognition, but is bound up with middle-class identity. Orwell continues in a phrase that prefigures Bourdieu's concept of the habitus. The fact has got to be faced that to abolish class distinctions means abolishing part of yourself. Why am I sharing this particular quote with you? Is because it isn't simply just about the middle classes being disgusted by the working classes that smell. It's actually about working class communities being disgusted by their own communities in these new times. In other words, we're not just simply seeing interclass disgust or condemnation, we're actually seeing intraclass condemnation and disgust operating in these new times. That's primarily the argument. And that's organized around racial geographies in urban cities. So, this gives a little bit of an outline of the aims, and I'll just go through those with you very briefly. What do these new urban experiences mean in relation to youth expressions in the new global city? Can people see? Yeah, okay, I saw some. Vis-a-vis desires and fantasies for belonging and security, for a 21st century idea of citizenship, through quite new, but also sedimented gendered forms of youth classification struggle, and diverse forms of symbolic racialization which both challenge and reproduce a national urban imaginary. How do we assess, for example, the transformation and localized sedimentation of young masculinities and femininities, as well as what Sarah Ahmed defines as a form of youth passing through nation spaces under the dynamics of a more than local and less than global form of moral regulation? And I won't be talking a lot about the youth subcultural community themselves, but I'll give you some ideas of the names of the groups that young people self-identified with in both sites. These are primarily Vancouver sites, but in doing more recent work with this data, I've got some interesting titles. The Hardcore Asians, or the Bad Boy Boxers, those are local Vancouver groups. The Jugs, a local Vancouver group. The Dark Whores, the Terrorists, the Gangsta Girls, and the Ginas, those are Toronto groups. Not the terrorists, pardon me, just the Gangsta Girls and the Ginas. Sometimes there's references to Good Girl Asians or a pop mix. What does it mean, and Mary Jane and Anoop have recently read a book about this, but to chart, not a book, pardon me, but an argument about global ethnography, to try and chart comparatively the ways in which urban class geographies have changed under quite new forms of nationalism, shape and reshape youth identification under these dynamic changes. And to try and assess how, even though there's proliferating theories about how important globalization is in this moment, how nation space still plays a major part in urban cultures, and some might argue as the new religion, and conflates these quite new classifications of the impossible citizen with particular temporal and spatial locations and forms of conflict. So that kind of gives you an overview of what I'm attempting to do, and I'm not going to read out these questions because I really want to move on and give you some kind of account of why it matters to think about youth subcultures in the past in urban cities and try and think about it in the contemporary moment. Right. I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea about, here's a mod for you, and this is a mod being arrested in the UK. For those people from the UK, after I give these talks, people always tell me, oh no, the mods did this, or no, the rockers did that, and Mary Jane was recently telling me that I wasn't quite right about amphetamine use among mods. It was, oh no, among the rockers, it was really the mods. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of clarification here. But here are some of the things that were said about the mods in the press. And they were called, when people reflected upon them, mockers. The concept of mods and rockers actually crystallized in the public consciousness at a specific place and time. Clacton-on-the-Sea in Essex during the Easter Bank holiday weekend of '64. After 2 days of comparatively mild violence in the wet seaside resort, the worst was a shop window being broken. The newspapers, however, were full of blaring headlines. Day of terror by scooter groups. Youngsters beat up town. 97 leather-jacketed arrests. The rockers wore black leather studs, had an anti-authority belief, and, I like this one actually, it's kind of cool, and projected an easy rider, nomadic romanticism. The rockers lived for the present with a scruffy, masculine, bad boy image. I think this one is, quite good. These long-haired, mentally unstable, petty little hoodlums, these sawdust Caesars, seem to find courage like rats by hunting only in packs. So what you're really saying is that their morons lay the discipline on hard. Essentially, you have to degrade and humiliate these groups. Good God, something ought to be done about them. Send them to the army. So, now, in trying to think about my contemporary aims in relation to this story, I want to start here. Quadrophenia, the celebrated '79 film inspired by the iconic rock band The Who, a story is narrated about the endemic conflict between two of the most prominent youth cultures of the late '60s. These groups apparently represented two quite different and oppositional working class youth subcultural groups and were stylized in extensive media coverage, as I've said already. Morons in need of discipline, moral correction, and is potentially very dangerous. Well, as you can see from that quote I gave, very little happened. There wasn't much danger going down. The first, less vilified of the two, the mods, were seen to symbolize the aspiring post-war working class, sharp suits, drain pipe trousers, and male femininity, R&B, jazz, soul music, and an imagined sophistication. The second, the rockers, were leather-jacketed bikers, occasional amphetamine droppers, I'm told, railway tea it was called, rock and rollers, defenders of a more traditional perception of the male working class as cults of emphasized masculinity. But who were these deviant, highly immoral, and mentally unstable young men? Famously reported as rats, bad boys, juvenile yobs, and to what effect? And why, particularly given all the radical transformations which have taken place in the new global city, here to name just a few? 9/11 fears, post-9/11 fears, incipient youth terrorist cells, increasing migration and asylum seeking among specific groups, and radically changed urban rearrangements. Should any reflection on these largely white mods and the rockers remain of interest to scholars today? If they are of interest, is it because what they did was so important to the state in kind of dangerous ways? Leisure activity, tame violence? Did they represent signs of moral risk, particularly as some of these groups, which many didn't know in North America, took their inspiration from Black America and the creative elements of the Black jazz movement, passing through, as Ahmed or Nyack might suggest, as nearly black, or as a hybridized concept of early manhood? Or were they challenging emphasized masculinity and nation in very particular ways, not unlike the emos, young emos do now? Why did they only expose, and I'm really sorry, the picture won't show up, I don't think. No, they're not there. What were famously reported as hissy bitch fights, these are two white girls having a fight at the beach, and largely passive young men, being arrested by the police. And if the mods and rockers were the true folk devils, why were they largely white men? So one of the things that I'm trying to argue here is that primarily the reason why they're still important to us is because they embodied and were narrating a cultural threat to Britishness by performing subtle and quite new sexualized forms of symbolic racialization, which undermine the idea of a cohesive British identity and associated middle-class moral register. So as everyone looks back to this as being dated and overdetermined by class and about being white, we've missed a story, I think, about this group and what it means for us today when we think about this. Was there a need to protect the nation from alternative forms, youth forms, which threatened essentialized understandings of Britishness for the future? It was to borrow from Said a kind of post-war Orientalism, a kind of purification operating at the sexualized epicenter of the public-private divide of the British state. Despite popular obsessions with globalization theory and everything is mobile and global, I'm not saying that's not true, it's not important, etc. It is precisely for these reasons that I believe moral panic when we study young people must always be seen as more than local and less than global. So, the forgotten points are about globalizing change and about the reality that nationalism still generates social anxieties about security, and that this has been going on long before 9/11. But here, of course, as before, the threat of those constructed as youthful folk devils provides the symbolic locus for the concentration of a general perception of uncertainty, loss, and anxiety closely tied to national imaginaries. Another rather neglected point in this story, I think, is that the study of youth and moral regulation is being ordered and regulated through wider classed ideals about the legitimate citizen, whose moral codes still remain premised on these hidden nationalisms, evoking dark folk devils, and I think we heard this story with Anouk, and urban legends from a foreign place. Race cannot therefore be uncoupled from class or masculinity or femininity in the study of youth and moral panic. To put this somewhat differently, if we are to take the concept of the folk devil seriously as a dramatic narrative woven into urban life, for example, the production of The Dangerous Male Foreigner, particularly in a post-9/11 context of bombing and Islamophobia, and against a radical changed background of migration patterns, we must confront a rather different constellation of questions and issues about young people and moral panic. For example, we must account for the ways in which terminology, of which I sometimes find a little esoteric, such as hybridization or the many others that are circulating, that they might serve as heuristic blueprints for how to think more carefully about the relations between nation selfhood and even religion. Indeed, religion might lie, for example, underneath new understandings of moral panic in the affluent West. It's grossly underemphasized in much of the Western theory and grossly overemphasized elsewhere. What might be these questions I'd like to think about? Are youth identities really representations of global mobility and fragmentation? Do these refusals, for example, symbolic refusals entertained by some youth cultures, including the ones that we studied, challenge the sedimented effects of the national imaginary? And does this imaginary emerge in gendered forms? Are the contemporary moral registers of social risk and anxiety in radically changed cities changing the ways in which working young men and women classify themselves and others in relation to the nation? And this is the piece that I want to share with you more than anything else. And what I'm about to move forward to do is to share with you. Oh, those are the, sorry, I take it back. Those are the girls. Can you see them? Right. And this is drawn from work Jackie and I have been doing together about how, in the contemporary moment, what's actually happening is this old narrative about the strange and foreign is re-emerging under heightened class retrenchment. And within communities themselves, people are reclassifying others within the same class platform as far more deviant, and that is primarily to do with being pressed up against what was once seen as a cohesive community and which is being invaded by foreigners. All right, so we might think about, for people who are local, the downtown east side, and how people are being pushed out of that space into what was traditionally a working class, quite cohesive, seen as quite cohesive working class community. And these are some of the stories that young people told us as they tried to describe this, and I'll try and give you some background here. Just very briefly, I'll take you through this. Chinatown stinks and is full of dirty homeless bums. The roads are all cracked up and has water from their fish tanks poured onto the street. I wouldn't go down at night because that's full of prostitutes too, hiding in their alleys. This is a young woman who lives very near the downtown east side in public housing and is from Cambodia. I've heard people talk about terrorists. Oh yeah. Do you get that one? Yeah, because I'm Muslim. They used to bug me about being terrorists. Osama bin Laden, that I bomb them and stuff because I'm Muslim. And how did that make you feel? I think it's funny there because I'm not really Afghani. So you said terrorists, that people are doing the suicide bombing thing, and you also said that some of the kids in the school say that about you, tease you. Kids tell me that story too. It's a pretty heavy word, right? Oh, well, I don't see it like that. Like, oh, how do you see it? I'm used to it. I just say, okay, thank you. Well, I don't fight back. I don't want to get back at somebody. There's no point the guy's going to call me whatever, so I'm just going to leave him alone. He thinks he's cool, etc., etc. This is somebody who's from Iraq, as it happens. This is another theme that emerges: the death of the Oriental female subject, embodied estrangement from a nation's space. This is an Asian school, and they're all so skinny and stuff. And yeah, it makes me feel bad, like I don't belong in Canada at all here with the Asian girls. I had this talk with my friend too, that there's this pressure on me because I'm big and I'm still Asian around them. Again, this embodied estrangement from being included in a space, but actually not being legitimate within it. I don't think you can see this image very well, but many of the visual images that emerged in the study pointed to a sort of deviant masculine subject who was identified broadly as Asian. And this is that more than local and less than global phenomenon of reclassification going on, because actually many of the young people doing these images were identifying, self-identifying as from Asia in that broad sense. So one of the arguments might be that masculinity and national constructions here are more than local and less than global, but operate in new cultural forms where these identifications are vilified if they are seen as poor. So the class dimension begins to move in here. We also see a deeply sexualized Orientalism as a kind of new classification struggle in relation to these urban changes. All right, there's another one, you can't see the image here, but you also see a kind of reverse effect. So Chinese students talking about white working class trash. That's in the Toronto data, very substantial, but when you see a homeless person on the street, you'd ask yourself, why are they even there? It's because they don't know what to do with their lives anymore. They're just short on cash, or they're just plain lazy. This is a first-generation immigrant from China who would be identified as working class. Right, so what might we try and consider? I'm going to sum up now. Promise, trust me. You know, I began by talking about what's hidden when we talk about young people in the nation state, and I'm interested in how young people living on the hard edge of this economy embody and perform particular classifications which are responding in part to wider forms of moral panic. The primary focus means that we need to move ourselves away from abstract conceptions of subjects and move towards the very signifiers of inequality which play some part in young people's navigation of a new and increasingly unequal global city. It is in tracing these signifiers, and this is where I'm drawing on quite a lot of work Jackie and I've done together, provide a window of illumination on the cultural, embodied, and deeply coded forms of symbolic violence which still operate through national narratives and their classifying functions. And one of the things that I'm trying to argue in this is that we need to see how these new classifications emerge, not only in relation to youth identification, particularly around and avoiding the concept of identity politics or identification with any kind of ethnicity per se, but about the ways in which the intersection between space, place, social class, and nation continue to lead to social reproduction on a much wider scale. I'll stop there.